The gunshot echoed through the New Mexico territory as the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged mountains. Abram Wilder's heart pounded against his ribs as he raced across the dusty plain toward his homestead, his stallion's hooves kicking up clouds of amber soil. It was 1876, and the land was unforgiving to men who showed weakness. Abram had never been one of those men until 3 days ago when he discovered his son was missing. The boy had been gone without a trace, vanished while Abram was out mending fences on the north side of his property. 6-year-old Thomas was all he had left of his wife Sarah, who died giving birth to the child. For 3 days, Abram had barely slept, barely eaten, scouring every inch of the surrounding countryside, asking every neighbor, every passing stranger if they'd seen a small boy with his mother's auburn hair and his father's deep blue eyes. As he approached the weathered barn that stood sentinel beside his modest cabin, something felt different. The door was slightly ajar, though he clearly remembered latching it before he'd left at dawn. Abram dismounted with practiced ease, drew his revolver, and approached cautiously. In these parts, an open door rarely meant something good. The hinges creaked as he pushed the barn door wider, his gun leading the way. Golden beams of late-afternoon sunlight filtered through cracks in the wood, illuminating dancing dust motes and casting long shadows across the dirt floor. And there, nestled in the hay beside his old mare's stall, was a sight that nearly brought him to his knees. Thomas lay curled up, sleeping soundly, his small chest rising and falling rhythmically. But what caused Abram's breath to catch in his throat was not just the relief of finding his son. It was the woman kneeling beside him, carefully tucking a colorful quilt around the boy's shoulders. He hadn't heard her approach or enter his property, yet here she was a stranger, tending to his son with the gentle care of a mother. "Step away from my boy," Abram said, his voice low but firm as he kept his revolver trained on her. The woman startled, turning toward him with wide eyes the color of summer sage. She raised her hands slowly, showing she was unarmed. "Please," she said softly, "I mean no harm. I found him by the creek yesterday, half-starved and scared. He was trying to find his way home." Abram lowered his gun slightly but kept it ready. "Who are you? How'd you know to bring him here?" "My name is Eleanor Lawson," she replied, slowly standing but keeping her distance from Abram. "I'm new to these parts. Bought the old Miller property about 5 miles east. Your boy told me where he lived, but he was so tired, he fell asleep before we made it all the way. I saw the barn and thought it would be safer than leaving him outside." Abram holstered his weapon, crossed the barn in 3 long strides, and knelt beside his son. His calloused hand trembled slightly as he brushed the hair from Thomas's forehead. The boy stirred but didn't wake. "He's been through a lot," Eleanor said, her voice gentle. "But he's strong, like his father, I imagine." Abram looked up at her then, really seeing her for the first time. She wore a simple dress, practical for frontier life, though there was something refined about her bearing that suggested she hadn't been born to this harsh existence. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back in a sensible bun, though wisps had escaped to frame her face. She couldn't have been much past 25. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I've been out of my mind with worry." Eleanor nodded toward the quilt. "It gets cold at night." "I thought he might need it." "You made this?" Abram asked, running his fingers over the intricate pattern of blues, reds, and golds. "Yes," she replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "I've always found sewing calming, even during the most difficult times." Thomas stirred then, his eyes fluttering open. When he saw his father, his face lit up with relief and joy. "Pa," he cried, throwing his arms around Abram's neck. Abram held his son tight, emotions he'd kept dammed up for 3 days finally breaking free. "I thought I'd lost you, son," he murmured into the boy's hair. "I went fishing, Pa, like you showed me, but I followed a jackrabbit and got lost," Thomas explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Then Miss Eleanor found me and gave me biscuits with honey and told me stories and said she'd help me find home." Abram looked up at Eleanor over his son's shoulder. "Seems I owe you more than I can repay." Eleanor shook her head. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not out here they wouldn't," Abram replied, knowing all too well how cruel the frontier could be to the vulnerable. "Please stay for supper, it's the least I can do." Eleanor hesitated. "I should be getting back before dark." "It's already too late for that." Abram said, noting the deepening shadows outside. "The trail to the Miller place is rough enough in daylight. You're welcome to our spare room for the night." Something flickered across Eleanor's face, caution, perhaps, or uncertainty about accepting hospitality from a stranger. But she glanced at Thomas, who was looking up at her hopefully, and her expression softened. "If you're certain it's no trouble," she said. "None at all," Abram replied, standing with Thomas in his arms. "Any friend of my son's is welcome under my roof." As they walked toward the cabin, Thomas chattering excitedly about his adventure, Abram felt a strange lightness in his chest. For 3 years since Sarah's death, it had been just him and Thomas, surviving day to day in their grief-shadowed world. Something about Eleanor Lawson's presence felt like a window being opened in a long, shuttered room, letting in fresh air and possibility. Little did he know that evening would mark the beginning of a journey that would change all their lives forever. Inside the cabin, Abram set about preparing a simple but hearty meal. Years of bachelor living had made him capable in the kitchen, if not particularly inspired. He put a pot of beans to warm on the stove and sliced thick pieces of salt pork to fry alongside. Eleanor stood awkwardly at first, clearly uncomfortable being idle while work was being done. "May I help?" she finally asked, already rolling up her sleeves. "You've done more than enough already," Abram said, but he recognized the determined set of her jaw and gestured toward a sack of potatoes. "But if you're offering, those could use peeling." They worked side by side in comfortable silence, broken only by Thomas's occasional commentary as he sat at the table drawing pictures with the stub of a pencil. There was an ease to their movements, as if they'd done this dance before, stepping around each other in the small kitchen space with natural grace. "So the Miller place," Abram said eventually. "That's a lot of land for one person to manage." Eleanor's knife paused briefly over a half-peeled potato. "Yes, well, I'm not afraid of hard work." "Didn't say you were," Abram replied. "Just making conversation." She seemed to relax slightly. "My husband died last year, influenza. We had a place back east, but after he was gone." She shrugged. "Too many memories. I needed something different, something that was just mine." "I understand that," Abram said quietly. "My Sarah, she passed bringing Thomas into the world. Some days this place feels haunted by what might have been." Eleanor's eyes met his, and in that moment of shared understanding, something passed between them, the recognition of kindred spirits who knew what it meant to rebuild a life from ashes. "How'd you end up here?" she asked, returning to her task. "This isn't exactly on the way to anywhere." Abram chuckled. "No, it surely isn't. I came west with dreams of striking it rich in the silver mines, found out quick enough I wasn't cut out for that life. Sarah and I met in Santa Fe where I was working as a blacksmith. She wanted open sky and land, so we scraped together every penny and bought this place." "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, and he could tell she meant it. "There's something honest about it." "Honest is a good word," Abram agreed. "The land doesn't lie to you. It's hard and it's fair in its way." They ate dinner by lamplight, Thomas regaling them with elaborate tales of his adventure, each retelling growing more fantastic than the last. Eleanor laughed at all the right moments, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Abram found himself watching her more than was proper, appreciating the way she listened to his son with genuine interest. After Thomas had been tucked into bed, Abram and Eleanor sat on the porch, the cool night air a relief after the heat of the day. The stars overhead were brilliant in their multitude, the Milky Way a dusty road across the heavens. "He's a wonderful boy," Eleanor said, breaking the companionable silence. "You've done well with him." "I've done my best," Abram replied, his voice rough with emotion. "When he went missing, I thought," he broke off, unable to complete the thought. Eleanor reached over and briefly touched his hand, a gesture of comfort that was withdrawn almost as soon as it was offered. "But he's safe now. Thanks to you." Abram turned to look at her, her profile illuminated by the soft glow from the cabin windows. "Why'd you help him? Out here folks tend to mind their own business." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. "I lost a child," she finally said, the words coming with obvious difficulty. "A daughter, she was 4. After my husband died, she got sick too. I couldn't save her." She took a deep breath. "When I found your Thomas looking so lost and afraid, I couldn't walk away, I wouldn't." Abram felt a knot form in his throat. "I'm sorry about your daughter, Emma," Eleanor supplied. "Her name was Emma." "Emma," Abram repeated softly. "That's a beautiful name." They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts, their own memories. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence, it was the kind that forms between people who understand that some pains are too deep for words. Before they retired for the night, Eleanor paused at the door to the spare room. "Mr. Wilder, Abram, please," he corrected. "Abram," she said, testing the name. "I should be on my way after breakfast tomorrow. I've cattle to tend to, and I'm sure you have your own work." "Of course," he said, though he felt an unexpected disappointment at the thought of her leaving. "But Thomas would be mighty pleased if you'd visit again sometime, and," he added almost as an afterthought, "so would I." Eleanor's smile was small but genuine. "Perhaps I will," she said before disappearing into the room. Abram stood in the hallway longer than necessary, listening to the soft sounds of her moving about the room, wondering what had possessed him to extend such an invitation. He was not a man given to impulsive gestures, especially not toward women he barely knew. But there was something about Eleanor Lawson that had gotten under his skin in the span of a single evening, a quiet strength, a depth of feeling that matched his own. As he lay in bed that night, sleep eluded him. His thoughts kept returning to the image of her kneeling beside his sleeping son, tucking that handmade quilt around him with such tender care. It was an act of kindness that spoke volumes about her character, about the kind of woman who would go out of her way to help a lost child. Morning came too soon, the first light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Abram rose and dressed quickly, wanting to have coffee brewing before Eleanor woke. But when he entered the kitchen, he found her already there, stirring a pot of oatmeal on the stove. "Hope you don't mind," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "I'm an early riser and I thought I'd make myself useful." "Not at all," he replied, moving to the stove to prepare coffee. They worked around each other as they had the night before, with that same effortless rhythm. Thomas joined them soon after, his hair sticking up in all directions, his face brightening when he saw Eleanor still there. "You didn't leave," he exclaimed happily. "Not without saying goodbye," she assured him, ruffling his hair affectionately, "and not without breakfast." Growing boys need their strength. They ate together, the morning light streaming through the windows casting a golden glow over the simple meal. Thomas dominated the conversation, asking Eleanor dozens of questions about her farm, her animals, whether she knew how to ride a horse, she did, and shoot a gun, she did that too. "Can I come visit you sometime?" he asked eagerly. "Pa could bring me, right, Pa?" Abram, caught off guard by his son's directness, glanced at Eleanor. "That would be up to Miss Lawson, son." Eleanor looked between father and son, something wistful crossing her face. "I'd like that," she said softly. "My place could use a child's laughter." After breakfast, Abram saddled his spare horse for Eleanor. Thomas insisted on giving her a tour of their small garden before she left, proudly showing off the vegetables he helped tend. Abram watched them together, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. When it came time for her to leave, Thomas hugged her fiercely. "Don't forget about us," he said. "I couldn't possibly," she replied, her voice thick with feeling as she returned his embrace. Abram walked her to her horse, holding the reins as she mounted. "Thank you again," he said, looking up at her, "for everything." Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the morning sun. "You have my quilt," she said with a small smile. "I'll have to come back for it sometime." "We'll keep it safe," he promised. Understanding this was her way of saying she would return. As she rode away, Thomas waving enthusiastically beside him, Abram felt as though something important had just entered his life or perhaps returned to it after a long absence. A sense of possibility, of hope, that he thought had died along with Sarah. Over the next few weeks, Abram found himself inventing reasons to ride near the old Miller property. He'd tell himself it was to check on a stray calf or investigate a broken fence line, but in truth, he was hoping for a glimpse of Eleanor. Once or twice he saw her in the distance, working in her fields or hanging laundry, but he never approached. It didn't seem right, somehow, to intrude on her space without invitation. Then one Sunday after church in town, he spotted her at the general store, examining a bolt of fabric. Thomas saw her at the same moment and broke away from him, running to her with unbridled enthusiasm. "Miss Eleanor." He called, skidding to a stop beside her. She turned, surprise giving way to pleasure as she recognized him. Thomas Wilder, as I live and breathe. My, but you've grown in just a few weeks. Abram approached more sedately, removing his hat as he neared. Miss Lawson, he greeted, suddenly feeling awkward and tongue-tied, like a schoolboy rather than a grown man of 32. Mr. Wilder, she returned, her cheeks coloring slightly. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten where I live. There was a teasing note in her voice that emboldened him. Not at all, he said. Just respecting your privacy. A woman living alone has enough to worry about without neighbors dropping by unannounced. Some neighbors would be welcome, she replied, her eyes meeting his briefly before dropping back to the fabric in her hands. We have your quilt still, Thomas piped up. Pa let me sleep with it every night. He says it's the prettiest quilt he's ever seen. Abram felt heat rise to his face. Thomas, it's true though, his son insisted. You said so, Pa. Eleanor's smile widened. Did he now? Perhaps I did, Abram admitted. It's fine work. An awkward silence fell, broken only when the shopkeeper called out to Eleanor that her order was ready. She excused herself to settle her account, leaving Abram and Thomas waiting. Pa, Thomas said in what he clearly thought was a whisper but was audible to half the store, why don't you ask Miss Eleanor to supper? I miss her stories. Abram hushed his son, but the idea had already taken root. When Eleanor returned, packages in hand, he cleared his throat. Miss Lawson, Thomas and I were wondering if you might join us for supper this evening. Nothing fancy, mind you, but we'd be honored by your company. Eleanor looked surprised but pleased by the invitation. That would be lovely, she said. But I have my wagon and supplies to get home first. We could escort you, Abram suggested. Make sure you get back safely, then return together. And so it was agreed. They helped Eleanor load her purchases into her small wagon, and Abram and Thomas followed on horseback to her homestead. The Miller place was looking better than Abram remembered. Eleanor had clearly been working hard. The fences were mended, the yard was tidy, and a modest vegetable garden was thriving beside the cabin. You've done wonders here, Abram commented as they unloaded her supplies. It keeps me busy, Eleanor replied. Keeps me from thinking too much. There was a weight to her words that Abram understood all too well. Work was a balm for grief, a way to exhaust the body so the mind might find some peace. Eleanor showed them around her property with quiet pride. She'd acquired a small herd of cattle, a few chickens, and a milk cow. Everything was organized with practical efficiency, evidence of a keen mind and determined spirit. You've accomplished all this on your own, Abram asked, impressed. I hired help for the heaviest work, she admitted. But yes, most of it, I'm stronger than I look. I don't doubt that for a minute, he replied, and he meant it. Thomas was enchanted with the place, especially the litter of kittens he discovered in the barn. Eleanor laughed at his excitement, promising he could visit the kittens whenever he liked. As the afternoon waned, they made their way back to the Wilder homestead, Eleanor riding alongside them on her own horse. There was an ease between them now that hadn't been there during their first meeting, the beginnings of friendship, perhaps something more, though neither would have admitted it aloud. Supper that night was a joyful affair. Abram had shot a brace of rabbits the day before, and Eleanor insisted on showing him how to prepare them with herbs she'd brought from her garden. They worked together in the kitchen, their hands occasionally brushing, each contact sending a jolt of awareness through Abram that both unsettled and exhilarated him. Thomas regaled them with tales from school, his animated storytelling keeping them laughing throughout the meal. After, Eleanor produced a small bag of peppermint candy she'd purchased in town, much to Thomas's delight. As the evening grew late, Abram realized he faced a dilemma. It wasn't proper to let Eleanor ride back to her homestead alone in the dark, but inviting her to stay again seemed presumptuous. Eleanor solved the problem herself. I should be heading back soon, she said, rising from her chair. The moon is full tonight, it should light my way well enough. I'll ride with you, Abram said immediately. Thomas can stay here, he'll be fine for the hour or so I'll be gone. Thomas, already sleepy from a day of excitement, didn't object to this plan. After saying his goodbyes to Eleanor, extracting a promise that she would visit again soon, he went willingly to bed. The ride to Eleanor's homestead was quiet, the moon indeed lighting their way across the open land. Stars carpeted the sky above them, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage and distant rain. "It's beautiful out here at night," Eleanor commented, her face upturned to the heavens. "Sometimes I sit on my porch after dark and feel like I'm the only person in the world." "Lonely?" Abram asked. She considered the question. "Sometimes, but there's peace in it too. Back east, we lived in a town where you could always hear neighbors, wagons on the street, children playing. Here, the silence has its own voice." "I know what you mean," Abram said. "After Sarah died, that silence nearly drove me mad. Now it's become a comfort of sorts." They rode in companionable quiet for a while before Eleanor spoke again. "May I ask about her, about Sarah, only if you want to share, of course." Abram found to his surprise that he did want to share. "She was like sunshine," he said softly. "Always smiling, always seeing the good in everything and everyone. We met when I was at my lowest broke, far from home, working for a blacksmith who was more interested in liquor than horseshoes. She saw something in me worth believing in when I couldn't see it myself." "She sounds wonderful," Eleanor said. "She was, and losing her—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. It felt like the world had suddenly gone dark. "If it hadn't been for Thomas needing me, I don't know what I would have done." Eleanor reached across the space between their horses and briefly touched his arm. "Children have a way of anchoring us to life, don't they, even in our deepest grief?" "That they do," Abram agreed. "What about your husband, if you don't mind my asking?" "Edward," she said, her voice soft with memory. "He was a good man, kind, thoughtful, a teacher by profession, always with his nose in a book. Not particularly practical, he could quote Shakespeare at length, but couldn't hammer a nail straight to save his life." She smiled at the recollection. "But he loved Emma and me fiercely. When he got sick, he fought so hard to stay with us." They had reached her homestead by now, the small cabin silvered by moonlight. Abram dismounted and helped Eleanor down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Wilder," she said formally, though there was warmth in her voice. "Abram," he reminded her. "Abram," she echoed, meeting his gaze. "And thank you for dinner. It's been a long time since I've enjoyed an evening so much." "The pleasure was ours," he replied. "Thomas adores you." "And I him," she said with a smile. "He's a special boy." There was a moment of tension between them, a current of unspoken feelings that neither was ready to acknowledge. Abram cleared his throat and stepped back, his hat in his hands. "Well, I should let you get some rest," he said. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Abram," she replied softly. As he rode home under the star-strewn sky, Abram found himself whistling a tune he hadn't thought of in years, a folk song Sarah used to sing while working in the garden. For the first time in a long time, the memory didn't bring sharp pain, only a gentle melancholy tinged with something new. Hope. The weeks that followed saw a gradual deepening of the connection between the Wilder homestead and Eleanor's farm. Thomas would ride over with Abram on Saturdays to help with chores and play with the kittens, now growing into proper cats. Eleanor would join them for Sunday dinner after church, sometimes bringing fresh bread or preserves she'd made. Word spread in the small community about the widow Lawson and her friendship with the Wilder family. Some gossip was inevitable, but most folks were kind enough to mind their own business. Life on the frontier was hard enough without making trouble where there was none. As summer ripened into August, a drought settled over the territory. Days stretched hot and dry, the sky a relentless blue without a cloud in sight. Crops withered in the fields and water sources dwindled alarmingly. Abram found himself spending long hours hauling water from the deeper parts of the creek to sustain his garden and livestock. One particularly scorching afternoon, he was returning from such a trip when he saw smoke rising from the direction of Eleanor's property. Without hesitation, he dropped the water barrels and raced toward her homestead, fear clutching at his heart. The fire was spreading rapidly through the dry grass surrounding her cabin, driven by a capricious wind. Eleanor was already fighting it, beating at the flames with a wet blanket, her face streaked with soot and sweat. "The barn," she shouted when she saw him. "The animals." Abram didn't hesitate. He rode straight through the smoke toward the barn where he could hear the panicked sounds of trapped livestock. Inside, the heat was stifling, but the flames hadn't reached the structure yet. He worked quickly to free the terrified animals, leading them out to safety before returning to help Eleanor battle the grass fire. Together, they fought the blaze, joined soon after by neighbors who had seen the smoke. It was grueling, desperate work, but by nightfall they had contained the worst of it. Eleanor's cabin was saved, though the barn had sustained damage and much of her fence line was destroyed. Exhausted, covered in soot and ash, Eleanor sat on her porch steps as the last of the neighbors departed. Abram, having sent Thomas home with a trusted neighbor hours earlier, sat beside her in silence. "I could have lost everything," she finally said, her voice hoarse from smoke and shouting, "if you hadn't come when you did." "But I did come," he said simply, "and you didn't lose everything." Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the last glimmers of the dying embers. "Why did you come? You must have been miles away." Abram met her gaze steadily. "I saw smoke, and I knew it was near your place. I didn't stop to think about it. You could have been killed," she whispered. "So could you," he pointed out. "Yet there you were, fighting it alone." "I'm not very good at asking for help," Eleanor admitted with a rueful smile. "Neither am I," Abram said. "Maybe that's something we could work on, together." The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment, Abram thought he had overstepped. But then she reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "I'd like that," she said softly. In that moment, covered in ash and smoke, exhausted to the bone, something shifted between them, a boundary crossed, a possibility acknowledged. Abram raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a promise of things to come. The fire marked a turning point. In the days that followed, Abram and Thomas virtually moved to Eleanor's homestead to help with repairs. Other neighbors pitched in too, in the way of frontier communities that understood survival depended on looking out for one another. The barn was rebuilt, stronger than before, and new fence posts were set along the property line. Working side by side day after day, Abram and Eleanor fell into a natural partnership. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, anticipating needs, sharing burdens, finding moments of laughter even amid the backbreaking work. Thomas thrived in this new arrangement, soaking up attention from both adults and displaying a remarkable aptitude for farm work despite his young age. One evening, as they sat on Eleanor's newly repaired porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas fast asleep inside after a long day of helping, Abram found the courage to speak what had been growing in his heart. "Eleanor," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain, "I've been thinking." She turned to look at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "A dangerous pastime, indeed," he agreed with a chuckle. "Particularly for a simple man like me." He took a deep breath. "These past weeks, working alongside you, seeing how you are with Thomas, how natural it feels for us to be together, it's made me realize something." Eleanor's expression grew serious, her eyes never leaving his face. "What's that?" "I never expected to feel this way again after Sarah," he said softly. "Never thought I'd find someone who could make me look forward to each new day, who could make me laugh, who could understand the parts of me I don't have words for." He reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. "I'm falling in love with you, Eleanor Lawson, and if that's too forward or too soon, I'll understand, but I couldn't keep it to myself any longer." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tightening around his. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "After Edward and Emma died, I thought that part of my life was over. I came out here to be alone with my grief, to find some way to keep going without them. I wasn't looking for love." She met his gaze, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But then I found a lost little boy by a creek, and he led me to you. And suddenly the future didn't seem quite so empty anymore." Abram's heart pounded in his chest. "Eleanor, I love you too, Abram Wilder," she said simply. "I love your kindness, your strength, the way you love your son. I love the man you are." Abram reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice a whisper. In answer, Eleanor leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a kiss both tender and certain, the beginning of something profound. When they parted, Abram rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by feelings too big for words. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "We can take all the time you need." Eleanor smiled, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "Abram, we're not young lovers. We've both lived enough to know what matters. I don't need time to know what my heart is telling me." They stayed on the porch talking late into the night, sharing dreams and fears, memories both painful and precious. By the time Abram reluctantly prepared to take Thomas home, a plan had begun to take shape between them, not just for their futures, but for their presents as well. 2 days later, Abram rode into town to speak with the preacher and obtain a marriage license. The news spread quickly, as news always did in small communities. By the time he returned home, 3 different neighbors' wives had already visited Eleanor, offering congratulations and subtle scrutiny in equal measure. "You'd think they'd never seen a widow remarry before," Eleanor commented with a laugh as she told Abram about the visits. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked, a hint of worry creasing his brow. "Not one," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him lightly. "Though I do wonder what Thomas will think." As it turned out, they needn't have worried. When Abram sat his son down that evening to explain that he had asked Eleanor to marry him, Thomas's reaction was one of pure joy. "Does that mean Miss Eleanor will be my new mother?" he asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "If you'd like her to be," Abram said carefully. "She's not trying to replace your mother, Thomas. No one could ever do that." Thomas considered this with all the solemnity a 6-year-old could muster. "I think Mama would be happy," he finally declared. "She wouldn't want us to be lonely." Abram felt his throat tighten with emotion. "No, son, she wouldn't. And Miss Eleanor makes the best biscuits," Thomas added pragmatically, causing both adults to laugh in relief. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in town. Eleanor wore a new dress of deep blue, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Abram, scrubbed clean and uncomfortably stiff in his Sunday best, could barely take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. Thomas stood proudly beside his father, the ring bearer, taking his duty with utmost seriousness. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Abram kissed his bride, Thomas let out a whoop of delight that set the entire congregation laughing. The celebration afterward was a community affair, with neighbors bringing dishes to share and musicians playing well into the evening. It was a day filled with joy, with hope, with the promise of new beginnings. That night, after Thomas had been put to bed in his room at Eleanor's, now their home, Abram took his wife's hand and led her to the porch where they had first confessed their feelings. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her into his arms. "More than I thought possible," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "And a little scared, too." "Scared of what?" Eleanor looked up at him, vulnerability clear in her eyes. "Of how much I love you both already, of how much I have to lose now." Abram understood her fear intimately. "I know," he said softly. "When Sarah died, I thought the pain would kill me, the idea of risking that again." He shook his head. "But then I realized something. The pain was so great because the love was so great. And living without love, that's no life at all." "When did you get so wise, Abram Wilder?" Eleanor asked, a smile playing at her lips. "Must be the company I'm keeping," he replied, bending to kiss her under the vast, star-filled sky. Life settled into a new rhythm for the Wilder family. They decided to make Eleanor's homestead their primary residence, as her land was more fertile and her house slightly larger than Abram's. Still, they maintained both properties, using Abram's old cabin as a base when working the further fields. The first year brought challenges, as all new beginnings do. There were adjustments to be made, habits to be accommodated, occasional misunderstandings to be resolved. But there was also laughter, warmth, and a deepening bond that grew stronger with each passing day. Thomas thrived with Eleanor's influence. She taught him to read with the patience and skill of the teacher's wife she had once been, spending evenings by the fire with books Abram could barely decipher himself. Under her guidance, the boy's natural curiosity blossomed into a love of learning that amazed and somewhat bewildered his father. "He gets that from Sarah," Abram commented one evening, watching Thomas absorbed in a book Eleanor had ordered specially from back east. "She was always smarter than me." "Different kinds of smart," Eleanor corrected, her hand resting on his arm. "You can read the land and the sky in ways I never could. You know when a storm is coming hours before the clouds appear. You can find water where others see only dry earth. That's intelligence too, Abram." Her faith in him, her ability to see and name his strengths, was a gift Abram treasured. In turn, he tried to show Eleanor each day how much he valued her, not just with words, though those came more easily to him now, but with actions. Small kindnesses, thoughtful gestures, the steady reliability of his presence in her life. As winter approached, Eleanor announced one morning over breakfast that they would need to prepare the spare room. "Are we expecting company?" Abram asked, puzzled. Eleanor's smile was radiant as she reached for his hand across the table. "In about 7 months, yes." It took a moment for her meaning to register, but when it did, Abram nearly upset the table in his haste to embrace her. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're having a baby," Eleanor nodded, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "A brother or sister for Thomas." Thomas, initially confused by the adult's emotional display, was ecstatic once the news was explained to him. He immediately began making plans for all the things he would teach his new sibling, from riding horses to catching frogs. The pregnancy wasn't easy. Eleanor suffered from severe morning sickness well into her second trimester, and the harsh winter kept her confined indoors more than she would have liked. But Abram and Thomas doted on her, bringing her wildflowers that somehow survived beneath the snow, reading to her when she was too tired to hold a book, massaging her swollen feet in the evenings. As her body changed, Abram found himself marveling at the miracle growing within her. At night, he would lay his hand on her expanding belly, feeling the movements of their child with a sense of wonder that never diminished. "I miss this with Thomas," he confessed one night as they lay together in the darkness. "Sarah was always so tired, and I was working double shifts at the blacksmith's to save money for the baby. I wasn't there for her the way I should have been." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "You're here now," she said softly. "That's what matters." Spring arrived with renewed hope and activity. The land awakened from its winter slumber, and the Wilder farm bustled with new life: calves in the pasture, chicks in the coop, green shoots pushing up through the freshly tilled soil. Eleanor, now in her final months of pregnancy, supervised much of the planting from the shade of the porch, her quilt making keeping her hands busy when her body demanded rest. She had started a new quilt for the baby, incorporating scraps from the one she had first wrapped around Thomas that day in the barn, a connection between past and future that seemed fitting. It was on a warm evening in late May when Eleanor's labor began. Thomas was sent to stay with neighbors, and the midwife was summoned from town. Abram paced the yard, memories of Sarah's difficult labor haunting him despite Eleanor's previous reassurances that her delivery of Emma had been straightforward. Hours passed, the sun setting and rising again as Eleanor's labor progressed. Abram was allowed in only occasionally, each time finding his wife more exhausted but still determinedly focused on bringing their child into the world. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he told her during one such visit, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. Eleanor managed a tired smile. "Remind me of that when this is over and I'm complaining about lack of sleep." Finally, as the new day reached mid-morning, the midwife called Abram into the bedroom. There, looking exhausted but radiant, sat Eleanor propped against pillows, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. Abram approached the bed on unsteady legs, his heart so full it felt like it might burst from his chest. The baby was tiny, perfect, with a dusting of dark hair and Eleanor's delicate features. "She's beautiful," he whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to stroke his daughter's velvet cheek. "Just like her mother." "I thought we might call her Sarah Emma," Eleanor suggested, watching his face carefully, "to honor both the women who came before." Tears spilled unchecked down Abram's face as he nodded. "It's perfect," he managed. "She's perfect. You're perfect." Later that day, Thomas was brought home to meet his new sister. His approach to the baby was surprisingly gentle, his usual exuberance tempered by awe. "She's so small," he whispered, peering down at the infant in Eleanor's arms. "You were this small once too," Eleanor told him. "And now look at you, a big brother with important responsibilities." Thomas straightened, pride evident in his bearing. "I'll take care of her always," he promised solemnly, "just like Pa takes care of us." Abram, watching from the doorway, felt his chest constrict with love for his family, for the son who had been his anchor through grief, for the wife who had brought joy back into his world, and for the tiny daughter who represented all their hopes for the future. As summer bloomed around them, the Wilder household adjusted to life with a newborn. There were sleepless nights and challenging days, moments of frustration balanced by moments of transcendent joy. Sarah Emma, nicknamed Sadie by Thomas, proved to be a good-natured baby with her mother's calm temperament and her father's observant nature. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues, Abram found Eleanor in the barn. She was standing near the spot where, over a year ago, she had covered a sleeping Thomas with her handmade quilt. Sadie was nestled against her chest in a sling, sleeping peacefully. "What are you thinking about?" Abram asked, coming to stand beside his wife. Eleanor leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "About how lives can change in an instant," she said softly. "I was so lost when I came here, Abram, so convinced that my heart was permanently broken, and then I found a little boy sleeping in this barn and everything changed." Abram wrapped his arm around her, drawing her closer. "He led you to us and you led us back to life. We saved each other," Eleanor corrected gently. In the quiet of the barn, with their daughter sleeping between them and their son's laughter drifting in from outside where he played with the barn cats, Abram Wilder knew a contentment he had never thought to experience again. The journey from grief to joy had been long and often painful, but standing here now, he wouldn't have changed a single step that led to this moment. "I love you, Eleanor Wilder," he said, bending to kiss her forehead. "And I love you," she replied, her eyes reflecting the last golden rays of the setting sun. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days after." As they walked back to the house together, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the evening sky, Abram thought about the quilt that had started it all, a simple act of kindness from a stranger to a lost child. Like that quilt, their lives had been stitched together from disparate pieces: grief and joy, loss and discovery. Endings and beginnings creating something beautiful, warm, and enduring. The legend of the cowboy who found his son sleeping in the barn, and the woman who covered the child with a quilt she'd sewn herself, became a family story, told and retold through generations of Wilders who worked the same land and lived in the same house. A story of second chances, of love found amid loss, of the family they created together, not perfect, but perfectly theirs.